On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Matt Birnbaum. He is the partner at Pear VC. We're going to be talking about equity, and we're going to be talking about equity, especially early stage startups, how much you should be setting aside, some of the factors that go into managing your option pool. I mean, we're not going to exhaust this subject for sure, but this is a very important question when it comes to even a candidate perspective, what they're looking for, founders. So that structure is going to be important to get right. Matt has written a fantastic blog article that we'll link to, and I'm super excited to have you on the show to talk to us about this, Matt.
Cool. Thank you, Amir. Happy to be here.
Awesome, man. So you guys at Pear VC, what type of company do you guys invest in over there?
So we're a VC focused entirely on early stage investing, meaning we're typically the first or second check into a company. We've been early investors in companies like Dropbox, Gusto, Affinity, Branch, Aurora, and others. And I am specifically on the platform side of the house, specifically running the talent team. One of the things to share is while we're a pre-seed and seed firm, our platform team is the size of many larger kind of multi-stage funds. We tend to be far more hands-on and results-oriented in what we do. So like less fluffy, honestly, than most of the VC platform teams in their offerings. I'm a bit biased here, but frankly, I think we're one of the best. Take my team for example. We partner with every founder where we're the lead investor, and partner for us means actually hire directly. So over the course of our time in existence, which is roughly over a year and a half, we've made 100 or so direct hires into our company, and are on track to be at 200 hopefully sometime next year. So that's a bit about who we are and kind of what I do for Pear.
Very cool. Very cool. So this topic, how to structure startup equity, especially when it comes to early hires. When we were talking about it, and I know you published a blog article on Pear VC, and we'll share that with everyone. It is a very important conversation, not just from the standpoint of trying to get it right up front, giving yourself flexibility, making sure everyone understands this equity piece, so that you can actually give yourself some opportunities to do the right things for your even new hires. Let's start at the top. And I guess when you're looking at this conversation of structuring equity, especially for the first few employees properly, why is it that important?
I think it's important because it sets the tone for kind of where someone is stepping into a company. And I think it's pretty nuanced in terms of what you should pay someone and why, right? There's a bigger calculus or calculation behind this, right? There's base, there's equity, there are a bunch of things that go into this. But generally, kind of what your goal should be is to align a compensation package, and kind of what we're focusing on today is equity in a way that rewards is the wrong word, but is commensurate to the amount of risk that somebody is taking by joining a company. Obviously, the earlier, the higher the risk, right? And where there are trade-offs that if things go as everybody hopes, there is outsized upside opportunity in the form of compensation based off of both the risk that somebody has taken and the success or outcome that may happen. I think one of the reasons why we decided to go down this path at Pear and create this resource is, one, we get a ton of questions about it from our founders. I think in large part because outside of compensation benchmarks, there are kind of few resources that kind of give people an understanding of kind of what the compensation should look like on the equity side. And two, because all the resources we saw out there, none really helped explain or give people perspective on how to think of equity compensation and actually how to understand this data that they were getting from benchmarks. And so this idea of like your first hire should get X amount of equity, or your fifth hire, if they are technical and mid-level in their career, should get Y. Really, the most detailed resources people had were just going to these benchmarks and saying, okay, well, the benchmark says X, therefore I'm going to pay X. Like there is more complexity and nuance to it. And we wanted to be able to give people a resource and set of tools to understand why the data looks like that in aggregate. So they could actually determine whether or not they were comfortable with that or make changes to what they were giving in terms of an equity package based off of a fundamental understanding of like how these numbers came to be.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned, notion about equity spend, and having some thresholds in place, understanding how that decision also downstream could affect it. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the equity spend and how a founder can help or hurt themselves with flexibility down the road.
Yeah, I mean, so there are some like rough guidelines or constraints around kind of as a founder what you have in terms of available equity to spend on employees, and that could be for new hire grants and or refresher grants, right? So we're all familiar with kind of concepts of equity pool set aside for employees. There are various names for them. If you do a priced round or an unpriced round, sometimes this is baked into the agreement you have with your investors. Other times it's not. But at its heart or at the crux of this is there's really a number which you have set aside out of your entire options pool to reserve for employees. There's a lot of information out there around like what is this right number. And there, not surprisingly, like a lot of, I would say, chest pounding from like rich VCs who are, telling their founders like, give away as much as you possibly can to your first employees because that's the most important thing ever. And so I've seen some crazy shit out there around creating equity pools of like 30 to 40%. I think fundamentally, like I get this idea that your first handful of employees should have outcomes that are significantly greater than kind of other people that join your team. But there's also some practical nature of like, there's only so much equity to go around. And if you burn through that too quickly, it creates issues. It creates issues for what people later on can get on your team. It creates potential dilution. And so what we really recommend is like on average, generally companies are setting aside roughly 10% of their equity for this options pool to kind of look at that as really the maximum equity spend. You can go tap that, but that comes with dilution. But if you set aside 10%, with that initial raise, that's generally more than enough to fairly compensate your employees, unless you raise a massive round and have the ability to hire, hundreds of people or even 10, 20, 30, 40 people. At that point, you have to worry about potentially giving away more equity than you have. But most companies at pre-seed and seed, which is where we specialize, are generally hiring 5 to 10 people. And in that world, this equation works really well. The other idea we share is like, it generally makes sense. Like, I'll equate this to your bank account. Like, my goal every month isn't to spend that down to zero, right? And so we want founders to apply that same level of kind of logic to equity spend. If you create a buffer, and this, is really a personal choice for each founder, we recommend roughly 25%. But if you set aside that buffer, what it does more than anything, one, is it does create space between you and that maximum amount of spend that you can do. Two, it provides flexibility on the back end. Maybe you find a superstar person that you want to hire. Maybe the business is taking off faster than you expect and you need to hire more people. Similar to creating a rainy day fund in your personal finances, like we just recommend creating a bit of a buffer when you're doing kind of calculations on spend, because that will get you to a point where maybe if things are going better than expected, or maybe there's some opportunistic hires you want to make, or maybe you just planned incorrectly, you don't find yourself in a position where you're constrained by the equity pool you set aside.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's nuanced, and obviously the explanations make a lot of sense. And I'm thinking if a founder's listening or somebody who wants to start a company's listening, and they're like, okay, well, when I first start, I don't know how big we're going to get. I do want to potentially land my first 1 or 2 people that I think are super crucial to me. And we see that all the time. It's founders. It's super important, those first couple, and they do get excited and they want to make sure they've locked in the best they can. How do they? And I guess, partially tapping your recruiter hat on this one. How do you help a founder make sure that they maybe scale back a little bit and realize that, yes, super critical. You want to get that, you mentioned, get that core right, but you can't give away too much, and you might have to let that candidate walk away or that hire walk away if it's just too rich for you to actually do the deal.
I don't want to contradict myself here, but you know, we will encourage founders to do what is necessary to close the right person. And so at times that means you are going to be spending 2x what your budget was for, your first, second, or third hire. I would be lying to you if I said we hadn't given that advice, or if I told you that like just certain people aren't that critical. Like if this is a hire you can make that is going to change the trajectory of your business, then do whatever it takes, right, to bring that person in. With that said, like this planning still provides some level of parameters. So like in the exercise that we did on the blog post in the calculator, we have in the example, the first 3 hires being critical to the business, like more on the senior end, in this world where 10% of equity is set aside for employees, there's a 25% buffer. You make these 3 hires. If I believe, I think we're still looking at like 4.5% of the equity pool remaining, right? So let's say, for example, you needed to double the equity of that first hire, senior technical, hire that you're making, like your founding engineer. And let's say you needed to stretch to 3% because this person is like that great. Like you could still do that. And because of that way we've set aside, created a buffer, the way we've created the equations behind it, like you still have a lot of equity remaining to set aside for hires 4 through 10 or even 4 through 20. And so this is the idea of if you are planful around this and certain things happen where you need to stretch your budget, it still works, right? And it doesn't put you in a position where you're going to your investors and you're saying, hey, my first 5 hires, we planned for 10 hires, but in my first 5, I spent all my equity, right? Like that's not a conversation that anybody wants to have, founder or investor. And so just this idea of being able to plan for a budget, having the tools to create that, even if to your earlier point, you can't plan to, the exact number of headcount you're going to be making, like all of that is still fine and it still works really well. The big message here is like, instead of like closing your eyes, looking at a benchmark and set of data and picking your number from there, like take those few extra steps to look at kind of, what you think your first 5 hires will be. What does that mean to your equity spend so that you can, if you need to stretch, feel really comfortable and know the repercussions or the downstream implications of doing so.
Fantastic. I mean, I think that's some great advice and insights. And maybe a follow-up question, because we talked about the candidate who might be asking for more. Obviously, we're talking from the perspective of the founder. A difficult area is sometimes the conversation between founder and early stage hire about the equity, what it's worth, and how to understand that value. When you talk to early stage founders, how do you advise them to have that conversation? Because it's a tricky one.
We generally, when we talk to our founders, we generally recommend that, I think probably through Series A, that when they present an offer, that they're presenting it in the form of a percentage of ownership in the company. I think you can get cute and you can create a dollar value based off of valuation, all of that stuff, but it's so low fidelity. Like in my mind, it doesn't matter, right? And so generally, if you can speak to percentage of ownership versus dollar value of equity, that's kind of the first steer that we'll give founders with regard to like how to present that offer.
No, and I think you're leading us there in terms of talking about as a percentage, because I think a lot of times a candidate gets an offer and it includes a certain amount of equity and they just don't know what it means. And I mean, we've all seen it. Not all the time we're in a situation where founders completely like, well, here's the pool, here's how much it's worth, and here's the percentage. It's this bit of a coy game, which I don't think necessarily helps either side. But obviously, there's reasons why we're talking about equity. The spend playing around that. So
Yeah,
that's kind of
sorry.
what I was alluding to.
So then I think it goes back to like just making sure that you're presenting it correctly, or in my mind correctly, in terms of a percentage of ownership versus a dollar value. Because I think the dollar value is bullshit. Maybe when you're a public company or later stage and there's more confidence that the company is truly worth X or Y and they're more comps, then great. Like I think you can do that, right? And that's what I've done when I've worked for or with later stage companies. I think the other thing where like we really want our founders to be able to have conversations with potential employees, and we want our employees to have this level of information around kind of why an equity offer looks like this is, if you have a resource like this and you've used it to derive what somebody should be getting, you can have a really honest conversation with the candidate around, hey, we have a 10% equity pool. We've set aside 25% as a rainy day fund. We are making 15 hires or anticipate making 15 hires, right? Of those 15 hires, 80% of them are going to be technical, right? The other 20% will not be. Of that, there's a distribution between kind of senior, mid, and junior. We see you coming in as a mid-level, right? Here is our calculus behind, what a senior person would get as employee number 6. Let's say this is your offer. This is what a mid-level person would get, and this is what a junior level person would get. Like having some firm idea and philosophy and framework, which is what we hope to provide with this calculator and this blog post, is really what will allow people to understand why their equity looks like X, right? And so actually recently, I think we talked about this briefly before kind of we hit record, is I have actually given this to candidates. I have said, hey, ask questions to the founder around what is their equity pool, right? How many hires are you making? What hire am I coming in at? And, what level am I coming in at as well? Because it helps give you a candidate perspective, one, around how they're looking at you. Two, the level of thought they put behind this, right? Most of the time, what founders are doing, because there aren't other resources, they're just going out there and they're saying, Benchmark said, you deserve, let's say pre-seed company, raised 3 million at a 10 to 12 million valuation, you should get X percentage at the 50th percentile. That's how this benchmark data works. There's a big difference if you're the first technical hire than if you're the 10th technical hire. Like arguably the first person should get significantly more equity than the 10th, right? And some people don't feel that way. That's another path we can go down if we want. But, the reality is the benchmark data doesn't reflect any of that. They'll give you one data point, right, for hires 1 through 10, but there's no differentiation between, what hire number 1 should get versus number 10. And that's the level of kind of nuance we want to give founders the ability to kind of understand and use something like the calculator to say, oh, okay, well, as employee number 1, if you're a senior technical hire, you should get 1.5% equity. But if you come at number 10, right, you should get a significantly lower percentage than that. And here's how that all maps to option pools, discounters or multipliers based off of experience and or technical versus non-technical background. That's what we want to empower founders to be able to do on their own and kind of think for kind of themselves in a way that's very principled versus just kind of relying on a set of like static data. We also want our candidates to feel comfortable that they understand the decision making and there's some logic behind it in a way that they can say, yeah, this feels fair and appropriate, or no, it doesn't, and here's why, and let me have that conversation.
Interesting. It's I'm listening, and it all makes sense. Obviously, I've had the luxury of going through the blog article, which I think I'm hoping people go through either after listening to this episode or before and take a look at it. Mention it early because I think it really does add context. The one thing that I keep coming back to in my mind, and I was listening to the first 10 hires, number 1 and number 10, is there a difference? I'm thinking back to risk from the standpoint of maybe both the founder and the candidate, because each one is taking on a certain amount of risk with that, first hire to even the fourth or fifth hire. Can you maybe touch on that component of this?
Yeah, there's a broader conversation around the variables that we talk about in this calculator, in this blog post, that determine kind of what someone's equity grant should be. So maybe I'll start there. What we talk about specifically is, folks that are early should generally get more equity than folks that come later. 2, if you're coming in a technical role, generally there is a multiplier or premium applied to kind of what equity grant you get. Similarly, if you are more senior than junior, you should get a bigger equity package. I think fundamentally those things are like not super controversial, I hope. That being said, like in our calculator, we say that let's say a new grad, or let's actually use what your question was, like the first hire versus the 10th hire, right? The way that this works is if you come in as the first hire versus a 10th hire, you're getting something like 7 times the equity that somebody is in the same role as hire number 10. Where there's nuance to this is like, if all 10 of these hires are made within like 3 months and the company is in the exact same position it was when hire number 1 came in and hire number 10 came in, it probably doesn't make sense to have that level of spread or that much spread in between the hires based off of time, right? Like there's probably not anything fundamentally 7.5 times or whatever the actual number is riskier than joining 3 months earlier for hire number 1 than it was hire number 10. And so that's where we ask founders to really think about kind of where they are in this journey and when they are making these hires. Because, if we take the extreme of this, or a more extreme example is like what we have is if you're a senior technical hire, the way the calculator works is if you're a senior technical hire, all the variables that we plug in kind of hold constant. If you are the second hire, you're going to get 1.2% equity. The first hire is going to get 1.5%. If somebody starts on January 1st and someone starts on January 2nd, like they probably should get the same amount of equity, right? Like there is no difference in terms of where this person is joining the company. And so that's where we give people the ability in the calculator to say, let me tweak these multipliers, right? So we call it the discount per hire. We model it out at 20%. Maybe it's 10%. Maybe it's 0%. Like these are all things you can do with the calculator in the calculator based off of how you want to approach this as a founder. And like we encourage people to do so and do say based off of like principled thinking or things that they truly believe. But we want to be able to provide a starting point for them to do this exercise. And so we plugged in 20%, even though 20% might not be practical. I'll talk briefly about like the technical and non-technical role. That there's some companies where your third, fourth, and fifth hire might be non-technical roles, and they might be as crucial as any technical role you hire. What we've modeled here is roughly a 50% discount if you're technical versus non-technical. That might not make sense, right? If the importance to the business at this time of building a company is maybe a technical person is as important as a non-technical person, then take that discount down to 25%, take it down to 0%. Like it is up to you as a founder to figure out how to do this, right? And so that's why we wanted to provide that. The same as if you hire I don't know, let's say you're a founder and like you dropped out of college to do this, right? Generally what we see as founders that do that tend to hire people that are very similar in terms of their experience. In this world, somebody that's a new grad might actually look like a senior hire within this company, and therefore that equity should reflect it. And so this isn't meant to be like the gospel or a hard, fast set of rules and numbers that people need to like follow, you know, blindly without kind of looking and thinking about their situation. We did want to provide like, hey, here is like a basic framework that you can use, but we also wanted to create variables that people could tweak based off of what was appropriate for their company. And for us, that was really important because a lot of that type of nuance is lost in benchmarking data, right? Benchmarking data really is based off an aggregate set of data that looks more at 1, 2, or 3 variables and group it together versus kind of having the ability to pull some of the kind of strings in between to really get a sense of what this should look like.
Fantastic, Matt. I mean, I think we could probably talk about this. Is still not exhaust the topic for hours, and I love the calculator. I love the blog article to help people. I think I actually looked for some resources myself in working with a couple of founders, and I didn't really find it. So I actually think I'm going to start sharing your work. It's fantastic. If somebody's going to want to reach out to you to pick your brain about this, or maybe even about Pear, what is a good way of touching base with you?
The best way is just hit me up on LinkedIn and I'll get back to you. And yeah, I think, Amir, what you touched on, like, I'll be honest, like we didn't set out to create this resource for anybody, but in our research, we read like hundreds of articles to figure out like, did this exist so we didn't have to recreate the wheel? And what was really surprising was that like, it didn't exist anywhere, right? And so kind of we felt that instead of having kind of this conversation with our founders, 10, 12 times a month, if we could create a resource, it would not only be helpful for them, but if we put it out in the world for everyone else to look at, that hopefully it could be something that other founders and even candidates would use. So, the genesis of this is very much in line with your experience. Was we just couldn't find anything that felt like a trustworthy or good enough resource to use for this type of thing.
Absolutely, man. No, we'll include some links to the article, obviously, and link to your profile so somebody can reach out to you. Thanks again for coming on. Thanks for sharing. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for the episode. We'll be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. 1, it's a great topic. I think we just scratched the surface. So reach out to Matt if you'd like to learn more. We'll link to this article. It has the calculator in there. I think it's a great resource. Share with another founder, someone else who's interested in learning more. Even as a candidate, I think it's really good to understand how some of this stuff is broken down. Like, subscribe. Let me know how the podcast is doing for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.